Maria Santos had been serving coffee and clearing tables at the Desert Rose Diner for 18 months when the first bomb threat arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. She had no idea that within 72 hours, her quiet dignity in the face of constant dismissal would inspire something that had never happened in the history of Bakersfield, California, and that her steady hands would save more lives than anyone thought possible. The Desert Rose Diner sat on the edge of Highway 58, a weathered building with cracked vinyl booths and fluorescent lights that flickered when the desert wind shook the windows. It catered to truckers, construction workers, and the occasional lost tourist, serving greasy breakfast platters and burnt coffee to people who were usually too tired or too rushed to notice the woman refilling their cups. Maria moved through the diner with the efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate much more dangerous terrain than a busy restaurant floor. At 34, she possessed the kind of quiet competence that comes from years of high-stakes responsibility. Though most customers saw only a middle-aged Latina woman in a stained apron and sensible shoes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore no makeup except for a touch of lip balm that she applied without looking in mirrors that had stopped reflecting hope years ago. The other waitresses at the Desert Rose treated Maria with the casual indifference reserved for people they considered beneath notice. Sandy Martinez, a bleached blonde who had been working at the diner for 8 years, made no effort to hide her disdain for the newer employee, who never participated in gossip sessions or complained about difficult customers. Crystal Johnson, barely 22, and still convinced that her waitressing job was temporary, viewed Maria as a cautionary tale, a woman who had somehow failed to achieve anything better than serving hash browns to strangers. "Maria, table 6. Needs more coffee," Sandy would call out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had appointed herself unofficial supervisor of the dinner's hierarchy. "And make sure you smile this time. These customers aren't charity cases." Maria would nod once and refill the coffee pot, never responding to the subtle insults that peppered Sandy's instructions. She had learned long ago that competence spoke louder than confrontation, that dignity was maintained through actions rather than arguments. Her service was flawless, her memory perfect, and her ability to handle multiple tables simultaneously was remarkable, though none of her colleagues seemed to notice these qualities. The diner's owner, Frank Castellanos, was a heavy-set man in his 50s who had inherited the business from his father and ran it with the casual cruelty of someone who viewed employees as replaceable equipment. He paid minimum wage, offered no benefits, and seemed to take pleasure in reminding his staff that jobs were scarce and workers were plentiful. Maria represented everything Frank disliked about the modern workforce: an employee who didn't laugh at his inappropriate jokes, didn't participate in the social dynamics that made him feel important, and somehow made him uncomfortable without ever saying or doing anything that he could officially criticize. "Santos," he would bark from behind the register, his voice cutting through the diner's ambient noise. "These coffee pots don't clean themselves. And make sure you're not giving away free refills to every vagrant who walks through that door." Maria would acknowledge his instructions with a simple, "Yes, sir," and continue working with the same steady efficiency that had defined her approach to every challenge she had ever faced. She cleaned the coffee pots until they gleamed, tracked every refill with mathematical precision, and maintained standards that exceeded anything Frank had ever demanded from his other employees, the customers who frequented the Desert Rose formed their own opinions about the quiet waitress who served their meals with professional courtesy, but never engaged in the kind of friendly banter that might earn larger tips. Truck drivers appreciated her efficiency, but rarely saw her as anything more than part of the diner's furniture. Construction workers from the nearby highway expansion project treated her with the casual dismissal they reserved for all service workers, people who existed to facilitate their needs without requiring acknowledgement as human beings. "Hey waitress," they would call out, snapping their fingers or tapping their coffee cups against the table. More coffee over here, and make it snappy. We've got real work to get back to." Maria would respond immediately, refilling their cups. With steady hands and maintaining the kind of professional demeanor that had been drilled into her through years of training that none of them could imagine. She never let frustration show in her expression, never allowed disrespect to affect the quality of her service, and never gave anyone reason to question her competence, even when they questioned everything else about her. The morning regulars included Jerry Patterson, a retired postal worker who complained about everything from the temperature of his eggs to the angle of the sun through the windows. He treated Maria with the condescending patience of someone who believed that her inability to speak perfect English reflected limited intelligence, though Maria spoke 4 languages fluently and had navigated cultural complexities that would have left Jerry bewildered and helpless. "Speak up, honey," Jerry would say when Maria asked about his order, his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "I can't understand what you're mumbling about. Maybe try speaking American for once." Maria would repeat her question clearly, her accent barely perceptible, but apparently offensive to Jerry's sensibilities. She had learned to modulate her voice, to speak slowly and distinctly, to avoid giving people like Jerry any excuse to dismiss her competence based on superficial characteristics that had nothing to do with her ability to perform her job. The diner's lunch crowd included office workers from the nearby business district, people who viewed their meal break as an opportunity to demonstrate their superiority over those who served them. They would discuss their important projects and significant responsibilities while treating Maria as if she were invisible, occasionally acknowledging her presence only to complain about service that was already exemplary. "This coffee tastes like it's been sitting for hours," complained Susan Walsh, a real estate agent who prided herself on being demanding. "Don't you people know how to make fresh coffee? I suppose I shouldn't expect much from a place like this." Maria would immediately brew a fresh pot, test the temperature and flavor herself, and serve Susan a cup of coffee that was perfectly prepared. She never defended the quality of her work, never pointed out that the coffee Susan had criticized was less than 30 minutes old, and never allowed personal insults to affect her professional performance. The evening shift brought a different crowd to the Desert Rose, people who were tired from long days and looking for quick meals before heading home to families and responsibilities. They were generally less demanding than the lunch crowd, but no more inclined to see Maria as anything other than a service provider, someone whose personal history and individual worth were irrelevant to their dining experience. Among the regular customers was Officer Tom Bradley, a local police officer who stopped by the diner during his patrol shifts. Bradley was a decent man who treated service workers with basic courtesy, but even he viewed Maria through the lens of assumptions about what a waitress in a place like the Desert Rose must be like. He saw her efficiency and professionalism, but attributed these qualities to good training rather than exceptional competence, work ethic rather than the kind of skills that had once made life and death decisions under pressure that would have left him paralyzed with fear. "Evening, Maria," Bradley would say, settling into his usual booth. "The usual coffee and pie, please. And thanks for always keeping this place running smoothly." Maria appreciated his courtesy, but she could see in his expression the same assumptions that everyone else made about her capabilities and her history. He saw a hard-working waitress who deserved basic respect, not a person whose background included experiences that he couldn't imagine surviving, training that he couldn't comprehend completing, and responsibilities that he couldn't fathom handling. Isolation that came with being consistently underestimated had become Maria's normal existence. She lived in a small apartment above the hardware store 3 blocks from the diner, a space that was clean and organized but sparse in the way that suggested someone who had learned to live with only essential possessions. Her neighbors knew her only as the quiet woman who worked at the diner, who never caused problems, and who seemed to have no family or friends visiting her modest home. Maria's evening routine was simple and solitary. She would return from her shift, shower away the smell of cooking grease and coffee, and spend her time reading books that she borrowed from the public library. Her reading preferences ranged from technical manuals to historical biographies, subjects that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as a waitress, but which reflected intellectual curiosity that had never been diminished by circumstances that had forced her into work that underutilized her capabilities. The books she read included detailed studies of explosive devices, emergency response protocols, and crisis management techniques. To casual observers, these might have seemed like unusual interests for a restaurant worker, but Maria approached learning with the same methodical thoroughness that she applied to every aspect of her life. Knowledge was power, and power was survival, and survival had been her primary concern for longer than most people at the Desert Rose had been alive. On quiet evenings, Maria would sometimes stand at her apartment window and look out at the desert landscape that stretched beyond the town limits. The vast emptiness reminded her of other places she had been, other landscapes that had tested her endurance and challenged her skills. But those memories belonged to a life that seemed increasingly distant, a chapter of her story that had ended. When she decided that survival was more important than recognition, safety more valuable than the respect that came with uniforms and ranks and acknowledgement of exceptional service, the transition from her previous life to her current existence had been gradual and painful. Maria had once been someone whose competence was not only recognized but essential, whose decisions affected the safety and success of operations that mattered on scales that the customers at the Desert Rose couldn't comprehend. She had been trained by the best, tested under conditions that eliminated anyone who couldn't meet the highest standards, and trusted with responsibilities that required the kind of courage and skill that civilian life rarely demanded. But that life had ended, not because of any failure on her part, but because systems designed to protect excellence sometimes failed to protect those who demonstrated it. Maria had seen too much, known too much, and spoken too much truth to people who preferred convenient lies. The transition to civilian life had been presented as an opportunity, but she understood it as exile, a gentle but unmistakable message that her services were no longer required by people who had once depended on her expertise. The skills that had once made her indispensable now seemed irrelevant to her daily existence. Her ability to remain calm under pressure was wasted on difficult customers who complained about cold food. Her expertise in crisis management was unused in a workplace where the biggest emergency was a broken coffee machine. Her training in explosives detection and disposal was forgotten knowledge in a world where the greatest threat was running out of pie before the dinner rush ended. Maria had accepted this diminished existence with the same quiet dignity that she brought to everything else in her life. She performed her job with excellence because excellence was her nature, not because anyone expected or appreciated it. She maintained her skills through private study and mental exercises because competence was a habit, not because she believed she would ever need those abilities again. But as she served coffee to customers who saw her as just a waitress, Maria Santos had no idea that everything was about to change. She didn't know that her quiet competence was about to be tested in ways that would force everyone around her to confront their assumptions about who she was and what she was capable of achieving. She had no idea that the skills she thought were obsolete were about to become the difference between life and death for everyone in the Desert Rose diner, and that her moment of truth was approaching faster than anyone could have imagined. First sign of trouble came on a Wednesday morning when Detective Ray Morrison walked into the Desert Rose diner with an expression that made the usual breakfast crowd fall silent. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of the Bakersfield Police Department, a methodical man who had earned respect through competence rather than charisma. He was also the kind of officer who noticed details that others missed, including the way Maria Santos moved through the diner with precision that seemed almost military in its efficiency. Morrison had been observing Maria for months, Not because he suspected her of wrongdoing, but because her behavior patterns intrigued him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. There was something about her situational awareness, the way she positioned herself to observe all exits, the manner in which she assessed new customers before approaching their tables. These weren't the habits of someone whose only experience was serving coffee and taking orders. "Maria," Morrison called out as she approached his usual booth, his voice carrying an undertone of professional concern. "We need to talk. Something's come up that involves the diner, and I want to make sure everyone here understands the situation." The conversation that followed would mark the beginning of Maria's transformation from invisible service worker to the center of a crisis that would test every assumption the people of Bakersfield had made about her capabilities. Morrison explained that the FBI had received credible intelligence about a planned terrorist attack targeting what they called soft civilian targets in small American towns. The Desert Rose Diner, with its location near major transportation routes and its status as a community gathering place, had been identified as a potential target. "We're not trying to panic anyone," Morrison said, his voice steady but serious. "But we need to increase security awareness. Everyone who works here needs to know what to look for, how to respond if something seems unusual, and who to contact if they notice anything suspicious." Sandy Martinez, who had been listening from behind the counter, immediately took charge of the situation with the kind of aggressive authority that she wielded over the diner's social dynamics. "This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when you hire people without proper background checks," she announced, her voice loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "How do we know who we can trust around here?" Her implication was clear, and her gaze settled on Maria with the kind of suspicion that had been simmering beneath the surface of their working relationship for months. Sandy had never hidden her resentment of Maria's competence or her discomfort with having a coworker whose background she couldn't categorize and control. Crystal Johnson, always eager to align herself with Sandy's opinions, nodded vigorously. "I mean, we don't really know anything about her, do we? She just showed up one day looking for work, and Frank hired her without asking too many questions. Now we're supposed to be worried about security threats." Frank Castellanos, who had been counting the morning's cash register receipts, looked up with the expression of someone who had been waiting for an excuse to assert his authority. "Detective Morrison, I appreciate you keeping us informed about potential security issues. As the owner of this establishment, I take the safety of my customers and employees very seriously. I want to make sure we're doing everything possible to protect this business." Morrison nodded, recognizing the political dynamics that were already beginning to shape the response to his warning. "The important thing is that everyone stays alert and reports anything unusual. We're not looking to point fingers or make accusations. We just want to make sure that if something happens, people know how to respond appropriately." But the damage had already been done. Sandy's implications had planted seeds of suspicion that would grow quickly in the confined environment of the diner's social ecosystem. Maria, who had been listening to the conversation with the kind of focused attention that others interpreted as nervousness, became the unofficial focus of concerns that had nothing to do with actual security threats, and everything to do with prejudices that had been looking for an excuse to express themselves. The change in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. Customers who had previously treated Maria with casual indifference now watched her movements with suspicious eyes. Her efficiency, which had once been taken for granted, was now interpreted as potentially threatening. Her quiet competence, which had never been particularly appreciated, was now viewed as secretive and possibly dangerous. Jerry Patterson, the retired postal worker who had always treated Maria with condescending patience, became openly hostile. "I always knew there was something off about her," he told Sandy in a voice loud enough for Maria to hear. "People don't just show up in places like this without reasons. Real Americans don't just disappear into minimum wage jobs unless they're Hiding something. Susan Walsh, the real estate agent who had always complained about Maria's service, now found new reasons to criticize everything about her behavior. She's always been too quiet, too. Watchful. I noticed it from the beginning. Normal people don't pay attention to everything the way she does. It's like she's studying us, learning our routines. Officer Bradley, who had always been courteous to Maria, found himself questioning his previous assessments of her character. His training had taught him to look for behavioral patterns that might indicate security threats, and when he applied that analytical framework to Maria's conduct, he began to see suspicious elements in actions that had previously seemed unremarkable. She does seem to know a lot about things that most waitresses wouldn't know about, Bradley confided to Morrison during a private conversation after his shift. Last week, she made a comment about the new security cameras they installed at the bank. How would she know about that unless she had been specifically observing them? Morrison, who had more experience with criminal behavior than Bradley, found himself caught between his professional instincts and the growing pressure from community members who were demanding action against potential threats. We need to be careful about jumping to conclusions, he warned. But at the same time, we can't ignore legitimate security concerns. The atmosphere at the Desert Rose became increasingly tense as the days passed. Maria continued to perform her job with the same professional excellence that had always defined her work, but now every action was scrutinized and interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Her precise movements were seen as calculated rather than efficient. Her ability to remember complex orders without writing them down was viewed as evidence of unusual mental capabilities rather than professional competence. Frank Castellanos, who had always resented Maria's quiet dignity, found himself under pressure from customers and employees who were demanding that he take action to address their security concerns. "I'm not saying she's done anything wrong," he told Morrison during a meeting in his office. "But my customers are nervous, my employees are uncomfortable, and I have a business to protect. Maybe it would be better for everyone if she found work somewhere else." The suggestion was presented as a reasonable business decision, but Maria understood it as something more sinister. She had seen this pattern before, in other places and other circumstances. Competence became threatening when it couldn't be controlled or categorized. Excellence became dangerous when it challenged assumptions about who was capable of achieving it. Maria's response to the mounting pressure was characteristically professional and dignified. She continued to arrive at work on time, performed her duties with meticulous attention to detail, and treated customers with the same courtesy that had always defined her service. But she also began to notice changes in her own behavior, subtle adjustments that reflected her growing awareness of the hostility building around her. She started varying her routes to and from work, a precaution that had become instinctive during her previous life, but which now seemed necessary for different reasons. She paid closer attention to the conversations happening around her, monitoring the mood of the diner and assessing the level of threat that the increasing suspicion might represent. She began to prepare for the possibility that she might need to leave Bakersfield, just as she had left other places when staying became too dangerous. The isolation that had always been part of Maria's existence became more pronounced as the community's suspicions grew. Neighbors who had previously ignored her now watched her apartment building with obvious surveillance. The grocery store clerk who had always been politely neutral now treated her with barely concealed hostility. Even the librarian, who had previously been friendly and helpful, now seemed uncomfortable when Maria checked out books that dealt with technical subjects. The pressure was building toward a confrontation that seemed inevitable. Maria could feel the weight of accumulated suspicion and resentment pressing down on her like a physical force. She had survived much worse situations than this, but those had been in places where she had allies and resources. Here, in the small desert town, she was completely alone, facing a community that had decided she was a threat, without bothering to learn anything about who she really was or what she had sacrificed in service to the country that now viewed her with suspicion. But Maria Santos had been trained to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when others were driven by emotion, and to maintain her professional standards regardless of external circumstances. She had no idea that her quiet dignity in the face of mounting persecution was about to be tested in ways that would force everyone around her to confront their assumptions about who she was and what she was capable of achieving. The storm was gathering, and Maria could feel its approach in the suspicious glances, the whispered conversations, and the growing tension that filled the Desert Rose Diner like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path. She had faced storms before, but this one felt different, more personal, more dangerous to the quiet life she had built for herself in this small desert town. The systematic campaign to force Maria Santos out of the Desert Rose Diner began exactly 1 week after Detective Morrison's security briefing. What started as whispered suspicions quickly evolved into coordinated efforts to make her working life unbearable, orchestrated by people who had convinced themselves that their prejudices were actually patriotic concerns. Sandy Martinez appointed herself as the unofficial leader of this campaign, using her seniority at the diner to justify increasingly hostile behavior toward Maria. She began by implementing what she called additional security measures that applied only to Maria, creating a separate set of rules and expectations that were designed to humiliate and isolate her from the rest of the staff. From now on, Maria needs to have her personal belongings searched before every shift, Sandy announced to Frank Castellanos, presenting her demand as a reasonable security precaution. We need to make sure she's not bringing anything dangerous into the workplace. It's for everyone's safety. Frank, who was already under pressure from nervous customers and looking for ways to demonstrate his commitment to security, agreed to Sandy's proposal without considering its discriminatory nature. The daily searches became a ritual of humiliation, with Sandy going through Maria's small purse with theatrical thoroughness, examining every item as if she were conducting a criminal investigation. "What's this?" Sandy would ask, holding up Maria's reading glasses as they were suspicious contraband. "And why do you carry so many pens? Most waitresses only need one. Are you writing down information about our customers?" Maria endured these searches with the same quiet dignity that she brought to every other aspect of her work, but the daily humiliation was taking its toll. She understood that the searches had nothing to do with security and everything to do with asserting dominance over someone who had been marked as an outsider. Crystal Johnson, emboldened by Sandy's example, began creating her own forms of harassment. She would deliberately take orders from Maria's tables, telling customers that there had been concerns about service quality and that she was providing additional support to ensure their satisfaction. She would also intercept Maria's food orders in the kitchen, claiming that she needed to double-check for accuracy before allowing meals to be served. "I'm just trying to help," Crystal would say when Maria attempted to reclaim her tables. "With all the security concerns, we need to make sure everything is perfect. Frank told me to keep an eye on things, and that's what I'm doing." The kitchen staff, influenced by the growing hostility in the front of the house, began treating Maria with increasing suspicion. Carlos Mendez, the line cook who had previously been friendly and professional, now avoided eye contact and seemed nervous whenever Maria entered the kitchen. He would prepare her orders last, claiming that he had mixed up the tickets or that there had been communication problems about timing. "It's nothing personal," Carlos told Sandy when she asked about the kitchen's cooperation with the new security measures. "I just want to make sure we're all following the same procedures. If there are concerns about someone, we need to be careful about how we handle things." The targeting of Maria extended beyond the diner staff to include regular customers who had been influenced by the growing atmosphere of suspicion. Jerry Patterson, who had always treated Maria with condescending patience, now refused to be served by her at all, demanding that Sandy or Crystal handle his table instead. "I don't feel comfortable having her around my food," Jerry announced loudly, making sure that other customers could hear his declaration. "There's something about her that makes me nervous. She's too quiet, too watchful. Real Americans don't act like that." Susan Walsh, the real estate agent who had always been demanding and critical, now found new reasons to complain about Maria's service. She would claim that Maria had been listening to private conversations or paying too much attention to personal information that customers shared at their tables. "She's always hovering around, pretending to clean tables but actually eavesdropping on what people are saying," Susan told Frank during a deliberately public confrontation. "I've been coming to this diner for years, and I've never felt like my privacy was being violated the way it is now." The accusations were baseless, but they created an atmosphere of suspicion that made other customers uncomfortable. People began to request tables that were not in Maria's section, or to ask specifically for Sandy or Crystal to handle their orders. The diner's social dynamics were being reorganized around the assumption that Maria represented some kind of threat. Officer Bradley, who had previously been courteous to Maria, now treated her with professional suspicion. He would time his visits to the diner to coincide with her shifts, positioning himself where he could observe her interactions with customers and staff. He began asking subtle questions about her background, her living situation, and her activities outside of work. "So Maria, what do you do when you're not working?" Bradley would ask, his tone casual but his attention focused. "Do you have family in the area? Friends? Hobbies?" It's always interesting to learn about what people do with their free time. Maria recognized the interrogation techniques that Bradley was using, subtle approaches designed to gather information without appearing overly intrusive. She answered his questions truthfully but minimally, providing basic information without elaborating on details that might be used against her later. Detective Morrison, who had initiated the security concerns, found himself caught between his professional responsibilities and the growing pressure from community members who were demanding action. He began conducting informal surveillance of Maria, following her home after her shifts and observing her apartment building to monitor her activities. "I'm not saying she's done anything wrong," Morrison told his partner during a briefing about the ongoing investigation. "But the community is nervous, and we need to be responsive to their concerns. If there's nothing suspicious about her behavior, then our surveillance will prove that. If there is something to worry about, we'll be in position to respond appropriately." The surveillance expanded to include Maria's interactions with other members of the community. Morrison began asking questions at the hardware store below her apartment, at the grocery store where she shopped, and at the public library where she borrowed books. He presented these inquiries as routine security checks, but they had the effect of alerting everyone in Maria's limited social circle that she was under official scrutiny. "We're just trying to build a complete picture," Morrison explained to the librarian when he asked about Maria's reading habits. "Someone who's planning something dangerous might be researching specific topics. We need to know if she's been checking out books about explosives, weapons, or security systems." The librarian, Mrs. Ellen Rodriguez, was troubled by the request but felt compelled to cooperate with law enforcement. "She reads a lot of technical books," she admitted reluctantly. "Engineering manuals, history books, some military biographies, but she's always been polite and quiet. She returns books on time and never causes any problems." Morrison noted the information about military biographies, adding it to a growing file of circumstantial evidence that painted Maria's intellectual curiosity as potentially suspicious. The fact that she was educating herself about subjects that most waitresses wouldn't study became another mark against her in the developing case for increased surveillance. Frank Castellanos, under pressure from customers and employees, began implementing additional restrictions on Maria's work responsibilities. She was no longer allowed to handle cash transactions, a policy that was presented as standard security procedure, but which effectively reduced her tips and made her work more difficult. "It's nothing personal," Frank told Maria when he announced the new policy. "But with all the concerns that have been raised, I need to make sure that we're following the highest security standards. You'll still be able to take orders and serve food, but Sandy will handle all the financial transactions for your tables." The policy meant that Maria had to coordinate with Sandy for every check and every payment, creating additional opportunities for humiliation and delay. Sandy would often claim to be too busy to handle Maria's transactions, forcing customers to wait while she finished other tasks that could have been completed later. The mounting pressure was designed to force Maria to quit, to make her working life so unbearable that she would choose to leave rather than continue fighting against the systematic harassment. The people orchestrating this campaign convinced themselves that they were protecting their community from a potential threat, but their actions were driven by prejudice and fear rather than legitimate security concerns. Maria understood exactly what was happening to her, but she also understood that responding with anger or confrontation would only provide her tormentors with additional ammunition. She had survived much worse persecution in much more dangerous circumstances, and she was determined to maintain her dignity and professionalism regardless of the pressure being applied. She continued to arrive at work on time, to perform her duties with meticulous attention to detail, and to treat customers with the same courtesy that had always defined her service. She endured the daily searches, the suspicious glances, and the deliberate obstacles that were placed in her path. She maintained her professional standards even when those standards were being used as evidence of her supposedly suspicious nature. Maria Santos had been trained to recognize when a situation was becoming untenable, when the pressure was building toward a confrontation that would force everyone involved to reveal their true character. She could feel the tension in the diner reaching a breaking point, and she knew that something was about to happen that would test every assumption the people of Bakersfield had made about who she was and what she was capable of achieving. Storm was intensifying, and Maria could sense that her quiet endurance was about to be tested in ways that would surprise everyone who had underestimated her capabilities and misjudged her character. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday morning in late April when Frank Castellanos called Maria into his cluttered office behind the kitchen. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and old grease, its walls covered with health department certificates and supplier invoices that reflected the marginal nature of the Desert Rose's operations. Frank sat behind his desk wearing an expression that mixed satisfaction with nervous anticipation, like a man who had finally found the courage to do something he had been planning for weeks. "Maria, sit down," Frank said, gesturing toward a plastic chair that had seen better days. "We need to have a serious conversation about your future here at the Desert Rose." Maria remained standing, her posture straight and her expression neutral. She had been expecting this moment, had seen it building through the weeks of systematic harassment and manufactured suspicion. Her military training had taught her to recognize when a situation was deteriorating beyond repair, when staying in position would become more dangerous than strategic withdrawal. "I've been getting a lot of complaints about your work performance," Frank continued, opening a manila folder that contained what appeared to be a collection of hastily written notes. "Customers are saying you make them uncomfortable. Other employees are worried about working with you. The police have expressed concerns about your background and your behavior." Each accusation was delivered with the kind of casual authority that Frank had always wielded over his employees, but there was something different in his tone now. He wasn't just asserting dominance over a subordinate. He was participating in something larger, something that made him feel important and righteous. The community's suspicions had given him permission to act on prejudices that had always simmered beneath the surface of his interactions with Maria. "What specific complaints?" Maria asked, her voice calm and professional despite the gravity of the situation. "I would like to understand what I'm being accused of so that I can respond appropriately." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unprepared for Maria to request details about the charges being leveled against her. The folder in front of him contained mostly speculation and hearsay, complaints that wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny, but which had been sufficient to justify the action he was taking. Sandy has reported that you've been asking suspicious questions about our customers, writing down information that you have no business collecting, Frank said, reading from one of the notes. Crystal says you've been making other employees nervous with your secretive behavior and your knowledge of things that normal waitresses wouldn't know about. Maria listened to the fabricated accusations without changing her expression. She had been expecting this approach, the transformation of her competence into evidence of wrongdoing, the reinterpretation of her professionalism as suspicious behavior. It was a pattern she had seen before, in other places and other circumstances. Jerry, Patterson has complained that you've been eavesdropping on his conversations and that you seem to know too much about his personal business, Frank continued. Susan Walsh says you've been studying the layout of the diner and paying too much attention to security cameras and exit locations. The accusations were a mixture of paranoid interpretation and outright fabrication, but they had been sufficient to build a case for Maria's dismissal. Frank had collected enough complaints to justify his decision to himself and to anyone who might question his actions. The fact that none of the accusations were supported by evidence seemed irrelevant to the process that was unfolding. Detective Morrison has suggested that it might be better for everyone if you found work somewhere else, Frank said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was delivering an ultimatum rather than making a suggestion. He's concerned about the effect your presence is having on community relations and the overall security situation. Maria understood that Morrison's suggestion was actually a directive, a polite way of telling her that law enforcement wanted her to leave voluntarily rather than face more formal action. The detective had positioned himself as a reasonable mediator, someone who was trying to solve a problem without causing unnecessary conflict, but his involvement gave Frank the official backing he needed to proceed with confidence. I'm not firing you, Frank said, attempting to maintain the pretense that this was a mutual decision rather than forced termination. I'm giving you the opportunity to resign gracefully, to leave with your dignity intact. You can tell people that you found better opportunities elsewhere, that you decided to move on to something more suitable for your situation. The offer was presented as a kindness, but Maria recognized it as a threat. The implication was clear: leave quietly and avoid official scrutiny, or face the consequences of continued resistance to the community's decision that she was unwelcome. Frank was giving her a choice between voluntary exile and more aggressive forms of persecution. What if I choose not to resign? Maria asked, her voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that made Frank suddenly uncomfortable. What if I prefer to continue working here and let my performance speak for itself? Frank's expression hardened, and for a moment, Maria could see the real man behind the pretense of reasonable authority. He was someone who had never been challenged by an employee he viewed as beneath his notice, someone who expected compliance rather than questions, submission rather than dignity. Then, I'll have to take more formal action, Frank said, his voice losing its conciliatory tone. I'll have to file reports with the police about your suspicious behavior, document the complaints I've received, and make sure that everyone in town knows that you're not welcome here. Is that really what? The threat was explicit now, no longer disguised as concern for Maria's welfare or the community's security. Frank was making it clear that resistance would result in public humiliation and official persecution, that choosing to fight would only make her situation worse. Maria stood silently for a long moment, considering her options and their likely consequences. She could resign quietly and disappear, finding work in another town where her past wouldn't follow her. She could fight the accusations and risk exposing herself to increased scrutiny that might reveal aspects of her background that she preferred to keep private. Or she could maintain her dignity and wait for the situation to resolve itself, trusting that truth would eventually prevail over prejudice. "I'll need time to consider your offer," Maria said finally, her voice betraying none of the emotion she was feeling. "This is an important decision, and I want to make sure I'm choosing the right path." Frank nodded, satisfied that he had achieved his primary objective of making Maria's position untenable. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But I should mention that some of our customers have said they'll stop coming here if you're still working when they return. I have a business to protect, and I need to consider what's best for the dessert rows." The economic pressure was another form of coercion, a way of making Maria's continued employment financially impossible for Frank to justify. He was positioning himself as a reluctant participant in her persecution, someone who was being forced to act against his better judgment by circumstances beyond his control. "I understand," Maria said, turning toward the door. "I'll give you my decision soon." As she left Frank's office, Maria could feel the weight of the entire community's suspicion pressing down on her. She had been marked as an outsider, identified as a threat, and targeted for removal by people who had never bothered to learn anything about her background or her character. The systematic nature of the campaign against her was familiar, but its intensity and coordination were more extensive than anything she had faced in civilian life. The afternoon shift at the Desert Rose was a gauntlet of hostile glances and whispered conversations. Customers who had previously ignored Maria now watched her every movement with obvious suspicion. Sandy and Crystal made no effort to hide their satisfaction with the morning's developments, treating Maria with the kind of triumphant contempt that came from knowing that their enemy was finally being defeated. "I heard you had a meeting with Frank," Sandy said, her voice carrying across the diner for everyone to hear. "I hope you're finally going to do the right thing and find somewhere else to work. This place needs people who fit in, people who understand what it means to be part of a community." Maria continued her work without responding to Sandy's provocation, but she could feel the tension in the diner reaching a dangerous level. The other employees and customers were waiting for her to react, to provide them with additional evidence of her unsuitability for their community. Her continued professionalism was being interpreted as stubbornness, her dignity as defiance. Officer Bradley arrived for his usual afternoon coffee, but his presence felt different now, more official and intimidating. He positioned himself where he could observe Maria's interactions with customers and staff, making notes in a small pad that he didn't bother to conceal. His surveillance had become open and deliberate, a clear message that law enforcement was monitoring her every action. "How's everything going today, Maria?" Bradley asked when she approached his table, his tone carrying the kind of false friendliness that police officers used when they were gathering information. "Any interesting customers? Any unusual conversations?" Maria recognized the interrogation technique, the attempt to gather intelligence while maintaining a casual facade. She responded with professional courtesy, but provided no information that could be used against her later. Her training had taught her to be careful about what she said to law enforcement officials who might be building a case against her. The day dragged on with mounting tension and increasing isolation. Maria could feel the community's decision crystallizing around her, the collective judgment that she was unwelcome and unwanted. She had survived much worse persecution in much more dangerous circumstances, but this felt different, more personal, more threatening to the quiet life she had tried to build for herself. As her shift ended, Maria walked home through streets that suddenly felt hostile and unwelcoming. Neighbors who had previously ignored her now watched from their windows and doorways, their expressions mixing curiosity with suspicion. The entire town seemed to be waiting for her to make a decision about her future, to choose between voluntary exile and continued resistance to their verdict. That evening, Maria sat in her small apartment, considering her options and their likely consequences. She had been forced to make similar decisions before, in other places and other circumstances. She understood the dynamics of persecution and the psychology of communities that had decided to scapegoat someone who didn't fit their expectations. But this time felt different, more final, more threatening to the identity she had created for herself in civilian life. She had no idea that within 24 hours, everything would change, that her quiet dignity would be tested in ways that would force everyone in Bakersfield to confront their assumptions about who she was and what she was capable of achieving. The explosion that shattered the morning quiet of the Desert Rose Diner came at exactly 7:43 a.m. on Friday, April 28th, but it wasn't the explosion that anyone had been expecting. Instead of the devastating blast that would have killed everyone inside, there was only a small puff of smoke and the acrid smell of burned electronics emanating from a device that had been carefully placed beneath table 12, where Jerry Patterson always sat for his morning coffee and complaints. Maria Santos was refilling the coffee station when the device activated, its timer reaching 0 after what must have been hours of silent countdown. The small explosion was designed to be a test, a proof of concept that would demonstrate the bomber's capability while providing a terrifying preview of what was to come. But instead of creating the chaos and panic that had been intended, the device's activation revealed something that no one in the Desert Rose could have anticipated. Maria's reaction was immediate and professional. While everyone else in the diner froze in shock or began screaming in panic, she moved with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of training in exactly these situations. She didn't run toward the exits like the customers. She didn't stand paralyzed like Sandy and Crystal. Instead, she approached the smoking device with steady steps and careful observation, her mind already analyzing what she was seeing and processing the information with expertise that no one knew she possessed. Everyone stay calm and move toward the exit slowly, Maria called out, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people obey without question. Don't run, don't push. Just walk calmly toward the doors and gather in the parking lot. Frank Castellanos, who had been in his office when the explosion occurred, emerged with his face pale and his hands shaking. What the hell was that? He shouted, his voice cracking with fear and confusion. Was that a bomb? Are we under attack? Maria was already kneeling beside the device, examining its construction with the kind of focused attention that revealed years of specialized training. What she saw made her blood run cold. The small explosion had been designed to damage the device's casing and reveal its true contents, and what was inside was far more sophisticated and dangerous than anyone in Bakersfield could have imagined. This was a test device, Maria announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was looking at. The main bomb is still active. Everyone needs to evacuate immediately. This building needs to be cleared in the next 10 minutes. The authority in her voice was undeniable, but it was also completely unexpected. The woman who had been dismissed as just a waitress was suddenly giving orders with the kind of professional competence that came from extensive experience with explosive devices. Sandy Martinez, who had been moving toward the exit, stopped and stared at Maria with confusion and suspicion. How do you know what kind of device this is? Sandy demanded, her voice carrying the same hostility that had characterized her interactions with Maria for months. How do you know there's another bomb? What aren't you telling us? Maria ignored Sandy's questions and continued her examination of the device. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The test explosion had revealed a sophisticated triggering mechanism that was connected to a much larger device hidden somewhere in the building. The bomber had used the small explosion to activate a more complex system that would detonate the main charge in exactly 15 minutes, giving people just enough time to panic and make mistakes, but not enough time to conduct a proper evacuation. There's a secondary device somewhere in this building, Maria said, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from reading the electronic components spread out before her. It's designed to explode in approximately 14 minutes. We need to find it and disarm it, or everyone in this area is going to die." Detective Morrison, who had been having breakfast at the counter when the explosion occurred, approached Maria with his weapon drawn and his face filled with suspicion. "How do you know so much about bombs?" he demanded. "Are you involved in this? Is this some kind of setup?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the disabled device, and Maria realized that even in this moment of crisis, the community's suspicion of her was so deep that they were willing to believe she was responsible for the attack, rather than accept that she might be their salvation. The irony was bitter and dangerous, because their distrust was wasting precious time that could mean the difference between life and death for everyone in the building. "I know about explosive devices because I was trained to deal with them," Maria said, her voice carrying a tone of command that made Morrison step back despite his suspicions. "I spent 8 years in the Army as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist. I've disarmed more bombs than you've written speeding tickets. Right now, we have 13 minutes to find and neutralize a device that will kill everyone in this building and probably everyone in the surrounding area." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Maria Santos, the quiet waitress, who had been suspected of being a terrorist, was actually a highly trained bomb disposal expert with the skills needed to save their lives. The woman they had been trying to drive out of town was the only person present who had any chance of preventing a catastrophe that would destroy everything they were trying to protect. Officer Bradley, who had been conducting surveillance on Maria for weeks, stared at her with a mixture of shock and recognition. "You're military," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was suddenly understanding things that had puzzled him for months. "That's why you move the way you do. That's why you're always aware of your surroundings. You're not a threat. You're a soldier." Maria was already moving through the diner, her trained eyes scanning for the telltale signs of a hidden explosive device. She looked for unusual wiring, for objects that seemed out of place, for any indication of where the bomber might have concealed the main charge. Her movements were systematic and professional, covering the space with the kind of thoroughness that came from years of training in exactly these situations. "The device will be somewhere central," Maria explained as she worked, her voice calm despite the ticking clock that was counting down to disaster. "The bomber wants maximum damage, which means maximum structural impact. It will be hidden, but accessible, somewhere that won't be noticed by casual observers, but can be reached for maintenance or adjustments." Crystal Johnson, who had been one of Maria's most vocal critics, followed her through the diner with growing amazement. "You really know what you're doing," she said, her voice filled with awe and guilt. "All this time, we thought you were the problem, but you're trying to save us." The search led them to the basement storage area, where Maria's trained eye immediately identified the anomaly that everyone else had missed. Hidden behind a collection of old chairs and broken equipment was a device that was far more sophisticated than anything a local terrorist could have constructed. It was military-grade explosive material with a timing mechanism that had been designed by someone with professional knowledge of demolition techniques. "This is what we're looking for," Maria said, her voice steady despite the fact that they now had less than 8 minutes to prevent a disaster. "Everyone needs to clear the building immediately. Get at least 2 blocks away. If I can't disarm this device, you don't want to be anywhere near here when it goes off." Frank Castellanos, who had been watching the entire situation unfold with growing horror, suddenly realized the magnitude of what was happening. "You're going to stay here and try to disarm it?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're going to risk your life for people who have treated you like garbage for months?" Maria was already examining the device's wiring, her trained fingers identifying the components and tracing the connections that would need to be severed to prevent detonation. "This is what I do," she said simply. "This is what I've always done. I protect people from explosive devices, regardless of how those people feel about me. Sandy Martinez, who had been Maria's most persistent tormentor, stood in the doorway of the basement with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything we did to you. We were wrong. We were so wrong about everything." Maria looked up from the device for just a moment, her eyes meeting Sandy's with an expression that contained no anger or resentment, only the kind of quiet dignity that had sustained her through months of persecution. "Apologies can come later," she said. "Right now, I need you to make sure everyone is clear of the building. This device is more complex than I initially thought, and I'm going to need complete concentration to disarm it safely." The next 6 minutes would determine whether Maria's years of training and experience would be sufficient to prevent a disaster that would devastate the entire community. She had faced similar situations before, in war zones and training exercises, but never under circumstances where failure would kill the very people who had spent months trying to destroy her life and drive her from their community. As the countdown continued, Maria worked with the kind of focused intensity that had made her one of the Army's most skilled bomb disposal specialists. Her hands moved with practiced precision, identifying and neutralizing the various components that could trigger the device's detonation. She had less than 5 minutes to complete a task that would normally require 20 minutes of careful preparation, but she had been trained for exactly these kinds of impossible situations. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. The woman who had been suspected of being a terrorist was now the only person who could prevent a terrorist attack. The skills that had made her valuable to the military were now making her invaluable to the community that had rejected her. The quiet competence that had been interpreted as suspicious behavior was now revealed as the expertise that stood between Bakersfield and disaster. With 3 minutes remaining on the device's timer, Maria made the final connections that would render the bomb harmless. Her training had been sufficient, her skills adequate to the challenge, and her courage equal to the task of saving people who had shown her nothing but suspicion and hostility. The device was neutralized, the threat eliminated, and the community saved by the very person they had been trying to drive away. The silence that followed Maria's successful disarming of the bomb was more profound than any sound the people of Bakersfield had ever experienced. It stretched across the parking lot where the evacuated customers and employees stood watching the Desert Rose Diner, waiting for an explosion that would never come. The absence of destruction was itself a form of revelation, a moment when everyone present understood that their lives had been saved by the woman they had spent months trying to destroy. Detective Morrison was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying across the parking lot with the kind of authority that came from years of law enforcement experience. "The bomb has been disarmed," he announced, though his words seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Maria Santos has neutralized the device. The immediate threat is over." But even as he spoke, Morrison's own words sounded strange to his ears. Maria Santos, the woman he had been investigating as a potential security threat, had just demonstrated expertise that exceeded anything in his own training. The quiet waitress who had been under police surveillance for weeks had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of person the community in a crisis, rather than the danger they had imagined her to be. Frank Castellanos stood in the parking lot staring at his diner, processing the reality that his business and possibly his life had been saved by the employee he'd been preparing to fire. The woman he had accused of being a security risk had just prevented a catastrophe that would have destroyed everything he had worked to build. The irony was so complete that he struggled to find words adequate to express what he was feeling. "She saved us," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She saved all of us. And we were going to make her leave. We were going to drive her out of town because we thought she was the problem." Sandy Martinez sat on the curb with her head in her hands, sobbing with the kind of grief that comes from recognizing the full extent of one's own cruelty. For months, she had led the campaign to isolate and humiliate Maria, convinced that her suspicions were justified and her actions were protecting the community. Now she understood that her behavior had been driven by prejudice rather than principle, fear rather than facts. "I was so horrible to her," Sandy said through her tears. "Every day, I made her life miserable. I searched her belongings, I questioned her every move, I turned everyone against her. And she just saved my life. She saved all of our lives." Crystal Johnson, who had been Sandy's most eager ally in the persecution of Maria, stood beside her mentor with her own face streaked with tears. The young woman who had viewed Maria as a cautionary tale now understood that she had been witnessing something entirely different. Maria's quiet dignity hadn't been the resignation of someone who had failed to achieve anything better. It had been the composed professionalism of someone who had achieved more than anyone around her could comprehend. "She never fought back," Crystal said, her voice filled with wonder and shame. "All those months we were attacking her, questioning her, making her feel unwelcome, and she never once defended herself. She never told us who she really was or what she was capable of doing. She just endured it all with such grace." Officer Bradley, who had been conducting surveillance on Maria for weeks, found himself reconsidering every interaction he had observed and every conclusion he had drawn. The behavioral patterns that had seemed suspicious to his trained eye now revealed themselves as the habits of someone with military training and professional discipline. Her awareness of exits hadn't been the paranoia of someone planning something dangerous. It had been the situational awareness of someone trained to protect others from danger. "I've been watching her for months," Bradley said to Morrison, his voice filled with professional embarrassment. "I documented her movements, analyzed her behavior, built a case file based on the assumption that she was a potential threat. Everything I interpreted as suspicious was actually evidence of the training and discipline that just saved our lives." The crowd in the parking lot began to shift and murmur as the implications of what had occurred became clear to everyone present. Maria Santos had not only saved their lives, but she had done so while knowing that these were the same people who had spent months trying to drive her from their community. She had risked her own life to protect people who had shown her nothing but suspicion and hostility. Jerry Patterson, the retired postal worker who had been Maria's most vocal critic, stood apart from the crowd with his face pale and his hands shaking. The man who had accused Maria of being un-American and had demanded that she be fired was now confronting the reality that his own prejudices had blinded him to the truth about someone who had served their country with distinction and was continuing to serve their community with quiet heroism. "I said terrible things about her," Jerry said to anyone who would listen. "I called her un-American. I said she didn't belong here. I demanded that Frank fire her. And all along, she was a veteran. All along, she was someone who had already sacrificed more for this country than I ever have." Susan Walsh, the real estate agent who had complained about Maria's supposed eavesdropping and suspicious behavior, found herself remembering every interaction with new understanding. Maria's efficiency hadn't been calculating. Her attention to detail hadn't been intrusive. Her professional competence hadn't been threatening. She had simply been applying the same standards of excellence to serving coffee that she had once applied to protecting soldiers from explosive devices. "She was just doing her job," Susan said, her voice filled with regret. "Every complaint I made, every suspicion I voiced, every time I made her feel unwelcome, she was just doing her job with the same professionalism she had learned in the military. I mistook competence for conspiracy." The arrival of additional emergency vehicles created a new focus for the crowd's attention. Fire trucks, ambulances, and FBI agents began securing the scene and conducting preliminary investigations of the bombing attempt. But even as official personnel took control of the situation, Everyone present understood that the real story was not about the bomber who had targeted their community, but about the woman who had saved it. Agent Patricia Reeves, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, emerged from the Desert Rose Diner after consulting with Maria about the device and its construction. Her expression was grim as she addressed the assembled crowd, but there was also a note of professional admiration in her voice that suggested she had been impressed by what she had discovered. The device that was placed in this building was sophisticated enough to have caused massive casualties, Agent Reeves announced. It was designed and constructed by someone with professional knowledge of explosive ordnance. The fact that it was successfully disarmed under these conditions required expertise that very few people possess. She paused, looking around at the faces of people who were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. Maria Santos is a decorated veteran with 8 years of experience in explosive ordnance disposal. She served 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, where she was responsible for disarming some of the most sophisticated improvised explosive devices our military has encountered. Her actions today prevented a catastrophe that would have devastated this entire community. The FBI agent's words carried the weight of official recognition, but they also served as an indictment of the community's treatment of someone who had served their country with distinction. The people who had suspected Maria of being a terrorist were now learning that she was actually a war hero who had risked her life repeatedly to protect American soldiers from exactly the kind of device that had been planted in their diner. Carlos Mendez, the line cook who had begun treating Maria with suspicion after the security briefing, stepped forward from the crowd with his head bowed in shame. "I stopped talking to her," he said, his voice barely audible. "When everyone started saying she might be dangerous, I avoided her. I made her feel isolated in her own workplace, and she was a veteran. She was someone who had already sacrificed more for this country than any of us." The maintenance worker who had been hired to install additional security cameras in the diner approached Detective Morrison with information that added another layer of irony to the situation. "I was watching the surveillance footage from this morning," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "Maria Santos spotted the device when she arrived for her shift. She saw it, recognized what it was, and started preparing for exactly what happened. She had been getting ready to save us before any of us even knew we were in danger." The revelation that Maria had been aware of the threat and had been preparing to address it, while still enduring the community's suspicions, added another dimension to her heroism. She had not only saved their lives in the moment of crisis, but she had been protecting them, even while they were actively trying to drive her away. Mrs. Ellen Rodriguez, the librarian who had been questioned about Maria's reading habits, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Those books she was checking out," she said to Detective Morrison. "The technical manuals, the military histories, the engineering texts. She wasn't researching how to build bombs. She was keeping her skills sharp. She was maintaining the expertise that just saved all of our lives." The crowd began to move closer to the diner, drawn by the desire to see Maria and express their gratitude, but also by the need to confront their own behavior and acknowledge the injustice of their treatment of her. They had spent months building a case against someone who had been preparing to protect them. They had persecuted someone who had been ready to sacrifice her life for theirs. As Maria finally emerged from the diner, her face calm and her bearing professional despite the emotional weight of what had occurred, the crowd fell silent once again. The woman who had been dismissed as just a waitress stood before them revealed as someone whose courage and competence had prevented a tragedy that would have destroyed their entire community. The silence stretched across the parking lot, filled with the weight of recognition, gratitude, and shame. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, not just the successful prevention of a terrorist attack, but the moment when an entire community was forced to confront the consequences of their own prejudices and the character of someone they had completely misjudged. The spontaneous applause that erupted from the crowd was unlike anything that had ever occurred in Bakersfield's history. It began with a single pair of hands, belonging to Carlos Mendez, the line cook who had avoided Maria for weeks out of manufactured suspicion. His clapping was slow and deliberate, each sound carrying the weight of recognition and profound remorse. Within seconds, the applause spread through the assembled crowd like wildfire, creating a thunderous ovation that echoed off the buildings surrounding the Desert Rose Diner. Maria Santos stood in the doorway of the diner, her uniform still bearing traces of the basement dust and electronic components she had just finished disarming. The applause seemed to surprise her more than the bomb had, as if she had been prepared for the technical challenge of explosive ordnance disposal but not for the emotional complexity of public recognition. Her expression remained composed, but those closest to her could see the slight tremor in her hands that revealed the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. Frank Castellanos pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down his face, his usual authority completely abandoned, in favor of raw emotion. The man who had been preparing to fire Maria less than 24 hours earlier now approached her with the desperation of someone who understood that he had come within minutes of losing everything he had worked to build, and that his salvation had come from the person he had been trying to destroy. "Maria," Frank said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I don't know how to apologize. I don't know how to make up for what I was going to do to you. You saved my business. You saved my life. You saved all of our lives, and I was going to fire you because I was too stupid and too scared to see who you really are." Maria looked at Frank with the same steady gaze she had maintained throughout months of persecution, but now there was something different in her expression. The quiet endurance was still there, but it was joined by a kind of tired recognition, as if she had been through similar situations before and understood exactly what was happening. "You were protecting what you thought was important," Maria sighed, her voice carrying no anger or resentment. "People make decisions based on the information they have and the fears they carry. I understand that. I've seen it before." Her forgiveness was more devastating than any accusation could have been. Frank realized that Maria's response revealed the depth of her character and the magnitude of his own failure. She had not only saved their lives, but she was doing so with a grace that highlighted the cruelty of their treatment of her. Sandy Martinez approached Maria with her face swollen from crying, her usual aggressive confidence completely shattered by the recognition of her own behavior. The woman who had led the campaign to isolate and humiliate Maria now stood before her with the posture of someone who understood that she had been not just wrong, but actively harmful to someone who had deserved their respect and protection. "I searched your belongings every day," Sandy said, her voice barely audible. "I questioned everything you did. I made everyone suspicious of you. I turned this place into a nightmare for you, and you stayed professional through all of it. You never once lost your temper or treated any of us the way we treated you." Maria nodded once, acknowledging Sandy's words without either accepting or rejecting her apology. Her military training had taught her to focus on mission completion rather than personal grievances, to prioritize the safety of others over her own emotional needs. The habit of putting duty before personal feelings had sustained her through months of persecution and was now helping her navigate the complex emotions of vindication. "You were trying to protect your workplace," Maria said simply. "You saw someone you didn't understand and you responded the way you thought was appropriate. I don't take it personally." But even as Maria spoke these words of forgiveness, everyone present understood that the situation was far more complex than her gracious response suggested. She had endured months of systematic harassment and deliberate humiliation, had been subjected to daily searches and constant surveillance, had been isolated from her coworkers and marked as a threat by the entire community. Her ability to respond with dignity rather than anger only highlighted the magnitude of what she had suffered. Crystal Johnson, who had been Sandy's eager apprentice in the persecution of Maria, stepped forward with her own face streaked with tears. The young woman, who had viewed Maria as a cautionary tale, now understood that she had been witnessing something entirely different, a demonstration of character under pressure that she had completely failed to recognize. "I was horrible to you," Crystal said, her voice filled with shame. "I repeated every nasty thing Sandy said. I spread rumors about you. I made you feel unwelcome in your own workplace. And you never once retaliated. You never once made me feel as small as I made you feel." Maria looked at Crystal with an expression that contained neither condemnation nor absolution, but rather a kind of weary understanding. "You're young," she said. "You were following someone else's lead, trying to fit in with the group. I understand. That impulse. I've seen it many times before." The crowd continued to grow as word of what had happened spread through Bakersfield. People who had never met Maria but had heard the rumors about the suspicious waitress at the Desert Rose were arriving to see for themselves the woman who had saved their community. The story was spreading with the kind of speed that only truth can achieve, carrying with it the recognition that an entire town had been wrong about someone who had been living among them. Officer Bradley approached Maria with his uniform hat in his hands, his professional composure completely abandoned in favor of personal remorse. The man who had conducted surveillance on Maria for weeks, documenting her every movement as potentially suspicious, now stood before her with the understanding that he had been watching a decorated veteran rather than a potential terrorist. "I followed you home from work," Bradley said, his voice thick with shame. "I watched your apartment building. I asked questions about your activities, your reading habits, your personal life. I treated you like a suspect when I should have been treating you like a hero. I should have recognized what you were, but I was too blinded by fear and prejudice to see the truth." Maria's response to Bradley's confession was characteristically measured and professional. She understood the pressures that law enforcement officers faced, the need to balance community safety with individual rights, the difficulty of making judgments based on incomplete information. Her military experience had taught her to work with police officers in various contexts, and she recognized the genuine remorse in Bradley's admission. "You were doing your job," Maria said. "You were responding to community concerns and trying to protect people from potential threats. I understand that my behavior might have seemed unusual to someone who didn't know my background. I don't fault you for being careful." Detective Morrison, who had initiated the investigation that led to Maria's persecution, stood at the edge of the crowd with his own face filled with professional and personal shame. The experienced detective who had prided himself on his ability to read people and assess threats had completely misunderstood the situation, allowing his investigation to become a tool for community prejudice rather than a means of ensuring public safety. "I should have dug deeper," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of professional failure. "I should have investigated your background more thoroughly. I should have recognized the signs of military training instead of interpreting them as suspicious behavior. I failed you as a detective, and I failed this community as a protector." Maria's response to Morrison was particularly significant because his investigation had been the official foundation for all the persecution that had followed. His misinterpretation of her behavior had given credibility to the community's suspicions, had provided the justification for the systematic harassment she had endured. "You were working with the information you had," Maria said. "Military personnel transitioning to civilian life often have difficulty explaining their backgrounds in ways that make sense to people who haven't shared those experiences. I understand why my behavior might have seemed concerning to someone who didn't know what to look for." The crowd was beginning to organize itself around the recognition that something unprecedented was happening. This wasn't just the successful prevention of a terrorist attack. It was a moment when an entire community was being forced to confront the consequences of their own prejudices and the character of someone they had completely misjudged. Jerry Patterson, the retired postal worker who had been Maria's most vocal critic, pushed through the crowd with his face pale and his hands shaking. The man who had accused Maria of being un-American and had demanded that she be fired was now confronting the reality that his own prejudices had blinded him to the truth about someone who had served their country with distinction. "I said you didn't belong here," Jerry said, his voice barely audible. "I said you weren't American enough, weren't patriotic enough, weren't worthy of being part of our community. And you were a veteran. You were someone who had already sacrificed more for this country than I ever have. You were exactly the kind of person who should be welcomed and honored, and instead, I tried to drive you away." Maria's response to Jerry was particularly significant because his hostility had been the most openly bigoted and personally cruel. He had attacked not just her competence or her intentions, but her very identity as an American, her right to be part of the community she had served in uniform. "You were protecting something you valued," Maria said, her voice carrying no trace of the anger that Jerry's words had deserved. "You were trying to preserve what you saw as the character of your community. I understand that impulse, even when I disagree with the methods." The extraordinary nature of Maria's responses was not lost on anyone present. She was extending grace to people who had shown her none, offering understanding to those who had offered her only suspicion, providing forgiveness to those who had given her only persecution. Her character under pressure was proving to be even more impressive than her technical expertise in disarming explosive devices. Agent Reeves, the FBI investigator who had been examining the bomb scene, approached the crowd with additional information that would add another layer to the developing story. Her expression was serious as she prepared to share details that would transform the community's understanding of what had occurred and what it meant for their future. The device that was planted in this building was part of a larger planned attack, Agent Reeves announced, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "We've identified similar devices at 3 other locations in the region." Maria Santos' actions today didn't just save the people in this diner. They helped us prevent a coordinated attack that could have killed hundreds of people across 3 counties. The revelation that Maria's heroism had implications far beyond Bakersfield added another dimension to the crowd's recognition of what had occurred. She had not only saved their lives, but her actions had helped prevent a much larger tragedy that would have devastated the entire region. The investigation that followed Maria's heroic actions moved with the kind of precision and urgency that only federal law enforcement could provide. Within hours of the bomb's disarming, FBI agents had established a command center in the Desert Rose Diner's parking lot, transforming the humble restaurant into the focal point of a multi-state terrorism investigation. Agent Patricia Reeves led the effort with the methodical thoroughness that had made her one of the Bureau's most respected investigators, but even she was amazed by the scope of what Maria's actions had helped uncover. The bomb's construction contained forensic evidence that led investigators to a network of domestic terrorists operating across 3 states. The device's sophisticated design included signature elements that matched explosive devices found at other planned attack sites, creating a trail of evidence that federal agents had been following for months without success. Maria's successful disarming of the device had preserved crucial forensic evidence that would have been destroyed in an explosion, providing investigators with the breakthrough they needed to unravel the entire conspiracy. The device's electronic components contained serial numbers that traced back to a military contractor in Nevada, Agent Reeves explained to a hastily assembled press conference. "The explosive material matches samples we've been tracking from a theft at a construction company in Arizona. The timing mechanism uses components that were purchased from a supplier in Colorado. Without the intact device that Maria Santos preserved, we would never have been able to make these connections." The federal investigation revealed that the Desert Rose Diner had been targeted not because of any specific threat it posed, but because it represented exactly the kind of soft target that domestic terrorists preferred. The bomber had chosen the location because it was a community gathering place where an explosion would cause maximum psychological impact while requiring minimal security planning. The irony that the attack had been prevented by someone the community had suspected of being a terrorist was not lost on anyone involved in the investigation. Detective Morrison, who had been cooperating with the federal investigators, found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining how his own investigation had focused on Maria Santos rather than the actual threat. His reports and surveillance records became part of the federal case file, but they also served as evidence of how prejudice and fear had misdirected law enforcement resources away from the real danger. We spent weeks investigating Maria Santos because she didn't fit our expectations of what a waitress should be like, Morrison admitted to Agent Reeves during a private briefing. Her military bearing, her situational awareness, her technical knowledge, all the qualities that made her capable of saving lives, we interpreted as signs that she might be planning something dangerous. Meanwhile, the real terrorist was moving freely through our community, planting devices and preparing for mass murder. The federal investigation also revealed the extent to which the bomber had been monitoring the community's response to Maria's presence. Surveillance equipment found in the terrorists' abandoned safe house included recordings of conversations at the Desert Rose Diner, documentation of the systematic harassment Maria had endured, and evidence that the bomber had been encouraged by the community's willingness to turn against someone they perceived as different. The terrorists saw the community's treatment of Maria Santos as proof that his ideology was correct, Agent Reeves explained to local law enforcement officials. He believed that the prejudice and suspicion directed at her demonstrated that Americans were ready to turn against anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of patriotism. The irony is that the person they were persecuting was actually the most patriotic person in the room. The bomber's identity, when it was finally revealed, shocked the community even more than Maria's heroism had. Thomas Mitchell was a 34-year-old construction worker who had been living in Bakersfield for over a year, working on the highway expansion project and socializing with many of the same people who had been suspicious of Maria. He was a white American citizen with no apparent foreign connections, someone who had been accepted by the community without question despite harboring extremist views that posed a genuine threat to public safety. Mitchell ate at the Desert Rose Diner regularly, Agent Reeves told the assembled media. He was friendly and outgoing, participated in community events, and was generally well liked by his coworkers and neighbors. He represented everything that the community thought they were looking for in terms of trustworthy citizens. Meanwhile, they were persecuting a decorated veteran who had risked her life repeatedly in service to her country. The revelation that the real terrorist had been hiding in plain sight while the community focused their suspicions on Maria Santos created a profound sense of shame and reflection among Bakersfield's residents. They had been so focused on their preconceived notions of what a terrorist should look like that they had completely missed the actual threat that was living among them. Frank Castellanos, who had been preparing to fire Maria just hours before she saved his life, found himself at the center of a media storm that examined how prejudice and fear had nearly prevented the heroic actions that saved the community. His decision to implement discriminatory policies against Maria, his willingness to bow to community pressure rather than defend a valuable employee, and his failure to recognize the character of someone who had been working for him for over a year all became part of the broader story about how bias can blind people to truth. I was so focused on what I thought Maria Santos might be that I never bothered to find out who she actually was, Frank admitted to reporters. I let fear and prejudice override my judgment. I was ready to fire someone who turned out to be exactly the kind of person any business owner should be grateful to have as an employee. The failure wasn't hers. It was mine. The broader investigation revealed that Mitchell had been part of a domestic terrorist cell that had been planning attacks on multiple soft targets across the region. The group's ideology was based on the belief that American communities were being infiltrated by foreign agents and that violent action was necessary to protect traditional American values. The irony that they had been planning to murder Americans in the name of American values was not lost on federal investigators. These terrorists claimed to be protecting American communities from foreign threats, Agent Reeves explained. But their planned attacks would have killed American citizens, destroyed American businesses, and terrorized American families. Meanwhile, the person they viewed as a threat was actually an American veteran who had spent years protecting American soldiers from exactly the kind of explosive devices they were planning to use. The media coverage of the story spread far beyond Bakersfield, becoming a national symbol of how prejudice and fear could blind communities to both threats and heroes. Maria Santos' story was featured on national news broadcasts in newspaper editorials and in magazine articles that examined the broader implications of what had occurred. Her quiet dignity in the face of persecution, combined with her heroic actions when the community her most, made her a symbol of the values that Americans claimed to cherish but often failed to protect. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Maria's background had been available to anyone who had bothered to look. Her military service records, her decorations for valor, her specialized training in explosive ordnance disposal, and her exemplary service record were all part of the public record. The community's failure to discover this information said more about their willingness to make assumptions than it did about Maria's efforts to conceal her past. Maria Santos never hid her military service, Agent Reeves pointed out. She simply didn't advertise it. Her discharge papers were on file with the Department of Veterans Affairs. Her decorations were documented in military records. Her specialized training was noted in her personnel files. The information was available to anyone who cared enough to look, but the community preferred to speculate rather than investigate. The federal investigation also examined the role that local law enforcement had played in the persecution of Maria Santos. Detective Morrison's surveillance reports, Officer Bradley's questioning techniques, and the overall response of the Bakersfield Police Department to community concerns all became part of the case study that federal investigators were compiling about how bias could compromise public safety. The local police department's investigation of Maria Santos consumed resources that could have been used to identify the real threat, Agent Reeves noted. Their focus on her suspicious behavior prevented them from noticing Thomas Mitchell's actual suspicious activities. They were so convinced that they had identified a potential terrorist that they stopped looking for the real one. The investigation's findings prompted a comprehensive review of how law enforcement agencies assess potential threats and respond to community concerns. The Maria Santos case became a teaching tool for police departments across the country, demonstrating how prejudice and assumption could lead to investigative failures that endangered public safety. Local government officials, who had been under pressure to take action against Maria Santos, found themselves having to explain how they had been prepared to support discriminatory policies against someone who turned out to be a community hero. The city council members who had been considering proposals to increase surveillance of suspicious residents now faced questions about how their policies might have prevented the very person who saved their community from being able to do so. We were prepared to pass ordinances that would have made it more difficult for people like Maria Santos to live and work in our community, admitted City Council member Robert Hayes. We were so focused on our fears about outsiders that we nearly drove away the person who saved us from a real threat. The failure of leadership wasn't Maria's, it was ours. The federal investigation continued for months, but its immediate impact was to transform how the community of Bakersfield understood both the threats they faced and the heroes who lived among them. Maria Santos had not only saved their lives, but she had also saved them from the consequences of their own prejudices and assumptions. Her actions had revealed the truth about who posed a real threat to their community and who was actually protecting it. The bomber's capture, when it finally occurred, provided the final piece of evidence that the community's suspicions had been not just wrong, but dangerously misdirected. Thomas Mitchell was arrested at a safe house in Arizona where federal agents found evidence of his involvement in the broader terrorist conspiracy. His capture was made possible by the forensic evidence preserved when Maria Santos successfully disarmed the device he had planted, creating a direct link between her heroism and the prevention of future attacks. The formal recognition that followed Maria Santos' heroic actions began with a phone call that Frank Castellanos never expected to receive. On the Tuesday following the bombing incident, the Desert Rose Diner's owner found himself speaking with a representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs who had been contacted by FBI agent Reeves about Maria's actions. The conversation that followed would mark the beginning of a series of events that would transform not only Maria's life, but the entire community's understanding of what true service meant. Mr. Castellanos, the VA representative said, "We understand that Maria Santos prevented a terrorist attack while working at your establishment. We also understand that she had been facing some difficulties with her employment there. We'd like to discuss how we can ensure that a decorated veteran receives the recognition and support she deserves." Frank found himself in the surreal position of explaining to a federal official how he had been planning to fire the woman who had saved his business and his life. The conversation was professionally courteous, but Frank understood that he was being evaluated not just as an employer, but as a representative of how American communities treated their veterans. The shame he felt was compounded by the recognition that his actions had been observed and judged by people whose opinions mattered far beyond Bakersfield. The first formal ceremony occurred at the Bakersfield City Hall, where Mayor Patricia Williams presented Maria with a key to the city and a formal proclamation recognizing her heroic actions. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of community members, many of whom had never met Maria but wanted to express their gratitude for her service. The contrast between this celebration and the persecution she had endured just days earlier was stark and unmistakable. Maria Santos embodies the very best of American values, Mayor Williams said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. She served our country with distinction in military combat, and she continued to serve our community with the same dedication and professionalism when she returned to civilian life. Her actions prevented a tragedy that would have devastated our entire region, and she did so while facing prejudice and suspicion from the very people she was protecting. Maria accepted the recognition with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her response to months of persecution. She stood at the podium wearing a simple blue dress rather than a uniform, her military decorations displayed on a table beside her as visual reminders of service that the community had never bothered to acknowledge. Her acceptance speech was brief and characteristically modest, focusing on the importance of community rather than personal heroism. "I did what I was trained to do," Maria said, her voice steady and clear. "I served this community the same way I served my country, by using my skills to protect people from danger. That's what service means. It's not about recognition or reward. It's about doing what's right when it needs to be done, regardless of the circumstances." The ceremony was covered by local and national media, with reporters focusing on the extraordinary contrast between Maria's treatment before and after the bombing incident. The story became a symbol of how prejudice could blind communities to the heroes living among them, and how crises could reveal both the worst and best of human nature. Maria's grace under pressure, both during the months of persecution and in the moment of vindication, became a model for how to maintain dignity in the face of injustice. The recognition extended beyond ceremonial gestures to concrete changes in how the community treated Maria and other veterans. The Bakersfield Chamber of Commerce established a Veterans recognition program that would ensure that former military personnel received appropriate acknowledgement for their service. The program included job placement assistance, housing support, and community integration services designed to prevent the kind of misunderstanding that had led to Maria's persecution. We failed Maria Santos as a community, Chamber President David Rodriguez admitted during the program's launch. We allowed fear and prejudice to override our judgment, and we nearly drove away someone who had already sacrificed more for our country than most of us ever will. This program is designed to ensure that never happens again. The Desert Rose Diner itself became a symbol of redemption and transformation. Frank Castellanos, working with community leaders and veterans organizations, converted the basement storage area where Maria had disarmed the bomb into a memorial space dedicated to all veterans who had served in combat. The space included displays about Maria's military service, information about other local veterans, and educational materials about the sacrifices made by military personnel and their families. This diner was saved by a veteran, Frank explained to visitors who came to see the memorial. Maria Santos risked her life to protect people who had treated her terribly, and she did it because that's what service means. This space is here to make sure that no one ever forgets what real heroism looks like. The memorial became a destination for veterans from across the region, many of whom had faced similar challenges in transitioning to civilian life. Maria's story resonated with former military personnel who had struggled with the gap between their military training and civilian expectations, between their specialized skills and the limited opportunities available to them in small communities. The Desert Rose became an unofficial gathering place for veterans who understood the unique challenges of maintaining military standards in civilian environments. Sandy Martinez, who had led the campaign to isolate and humiliate Maria, underwent her own transformation in the aftermath of the bombing incident. Her recognition of how wrong she had been about Maria prompted a period of deep self-reflection that resulted in her becoming one of the most vocal advocates for veterans' rights in the community. She enrolled in courses about military culture and transition issues, determined to understand the experiences of people she had previously misjudged. I was so focused on what I thought Maria should be that I never bothered to learn who she actually was, Sandy said during a community forum on veterans issues. I let my ignorance and prejudice turn me into someone I'm ashamed of. I can't undo the damage I caused, but I can make sure that other veterans don't face the same treatment from people who don't understand their service. Crystal Johnson, who had been Sandy's apprentice in the persecution of Maria, found her own path to redemption through service to other veterans. She left her job at the Desert Rose to work with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to female veterans, inspired by Maria's example of quiet strength and professional excellence. Her work became a way of honoring Maria's service while addressing the broader challenges faced by women who had served in combat roles. Maria showed me what real strength looks like, Crystal said. She endured months of harassment and persecution without ever losing her professionalism or her dignity. She saved our lives while we were making hers miserable. I want to make sure that other women veterans get the support and recognition they deserve from the beginning, not just after they've proven themselves in crisis. The broader impact of Maria's story extended to police departments and law enforcement agencies across the region. Detective Morrison's investigation, which had focused on Maria as a potential threat while missing the actual terrorist, became a case study in how bias could compromise public safety. Police departments began implementing new training programs designed to help officers recognize the signs of military training and distinguish between competence and conspiracy. The Maria Santos case taught us that our assumptions about who looks dangerous and who looks trustworthy can be completely wrong, explained Captain Jennifer Walsh, who oversaw the new training program. We were so focused on profiling-based on stereotypes that we missed the real threat and persecuted the person who was actually protecting us. Our officers need to understand that competence and confidence don't equal suspicion. Officer Bradley, who had conducted surveillance on Maria for weeks, became one of the most effective advocates for the new training program. His personal experience with how prejudice had corrupted his professional judgment made him uniquely qualified to help other officers avoid similar mistakes. He developed training scenarios based on the Maria Santos case, using her story to illustrate how military veterans might be misunderstood by law enforcement officers unfamiliar with military culture. I watched Maria Santos for months, documenting her behavior as potentially suspicious, Bradley said during training sessions. Everything I saw as threatening was actually evidence of the training and discipline that saved our lives. I learned that my job as a police officer is to protect people like Maria Santos, not to persecute them based on my own ignorance about military service. The federal recognition of Maria's actions reached its culmination when she was invited to Washington, D.C. to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The ceremony was attended by veterans from across the country, many of whom had faced similar challenges in transitioning to civilian life. Maria's story had become a symbol of the ongoing service that veterans provided to their communities, even after their military careers had ended. Maria Santos represents the very best of American service, the president said during the ceremony. She served our country with distinction in military combat, and she continued to serve her community with the same dedication when she returned to civilian life. Her actions prevented a tragedy that would have devastated an entire region, and she did so while facing prejudice from the very people she was protecting. She embodies the values that make our nation strong. Maria accepted the medal with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her response to both persecution and recognition. She stood in the East Room of the White House wearing her military dress uniform, her decorations reflecting years of service that had finally been acknowledged by the community she had protected. Her acceptance speech was brief and focused on the broader issues facing veterans and the importance of community support. "This recognition is not just for me," Maria said. "It's for all the veterans who continue to serve their communities in ways that often go unnoticed. We were trained to protect others, and that training doesn't end when we leave the military. Every day, veterans are using their skills to make their communities safer, stronger, and better. They deserve recognition, not just when they save lives, in dramatic circumstances, but every day they choose to serve others over themselves." The ceremony was broadcast nationally, with Maria's story becoming a rallying cry for better treatment of veterans and greater awareness of the contributions they made to their communities. Her transformation from suspected terrorist to national hero became a symbol of how prejudice could blind people to the heroism that existed among them, and how crisis could reveal the true character of both individuals and communities. 5 years after the bombing incident that transformed her life and the community of Bakersfield, Maria Santos stood before a graduating class of explosive ordnance disposal specialists at the Defense Advanced Training Center in Virginia. The auditorium was filled with young soldiers who had completed the same rigorous training that had prepared her for that crucial moment in the Desert Rose Diner. As the keynote speaker for their graduation ceremony, Maria represented not just the technical excellence they aspired to achieve, but the kind of character that would define their service long after they left the military. "Excellence is not a destination," Maria told the assembled graduates, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had demonstrated that excellence under the most challenging circumstances. "It's a way of approaching every task, every responsibility, every moment when someone else's safety depends on your competence. The skills you've learned here will serve you well in military operations, but they will also serve you throughout your lives in ways you cannot yet imagine." The Maria Santos Foundation for Veterans Integration had become one of the most successful programs in the country, for helping military personnel transition to civilian careers. Headquartered in a renovated building just 2 blocks from the Desert Rose Diner, the foundation provided job training, education assistance, and community integration services to thousands of veterans each year. The program's success was measured not just in employment statistics, but in the stories of veterans who had found meaningful work and community acceptance after completing their military service. Maria's story taught us that the transition from military to civilian life is not just about finding jobs, explained Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the Foundation's executive director and Maria's former mentor. It's about helping communities understand the value that veterans bring to civilian life and helping veterans translate their military skills into contributions that their communities can recognize and appreciate. The Foundation's flagship program was the Community Integration Initiative, which paired veterans with local employers and community organizations to create meaningful employment opportunities that utilized military training and experience. The program had been replicated in over 40 states, with each location adapting Maria's model to meet the specific needs of local veteran populations and community conditions. The Desert Rose Diner had become an unlikely pilgrimage site for veterans and their families from across the country. The basement memorial had been expanded into a full museum dedicated to veterans' service and sacrifice, with interactive displays that told the stories of military personnel who had continued to serve their communities after completing their active duty. The museum drew over 50,000 visitors each year, many of whom came specifically to see the space where Maria had prevented a terrorist attack. "People come here to understand what service really means," said Frank Castellanos, who had transformed from Maria's reluctant employer to one of her most dedicated supporters. "They want to see where someone chose to risk her life for people who had treated her terribly, and they want to understand how that choice reflects the values that make our country strong." Frank had become a national advocate for veterans' employment, speaking at conferences and business forums about the importance of recognizing military skills and experience in civilian hiring practices. His transformation from someone who had been prepared to fire Maria to someone who championed veterans' rights had become part of the broader story about how individuals and communities could change when confronted with the consequences of their prejudices. The memorial garden behind the diner featured a bronze statue of Maria disarming the bomb, but the inscription focused not on her heroism in that moment, but on her quiet service in the months leading up to it. The text read, "Dedicated to all veterans who serve their communities with dignity and professionalism, regardless of recognition or reward. Excellence is its own virtue, and service is its own honor." Sandy Martinez had become the director of the Foundation's community outreach program, working to educate civilians about military culture and the challenges faced by veterans in transition. Her transformation from Maria's primary tormentor to one of her most effective advocates had been complete and genuine, driven by a recognition of how her own prejudices had nearly prevented Maria from saving the community. "I learned that ignorance is not just embarrassing, it's dangerous," Sandy explained during a conference presentation about unconscious bias. "My prejudice against Maria could have cost people their lives. It could have prevented her from being in position to save us when we needed her most." Education about military culture and veterans' experiences is not just about being nice to people who served our country. It's about recognizing the resources and capabilities that exist in our communities. Crystal Johnson had completed her master's degree in social work and was now directing a program that provided counseling and support services to female veterans. Her work focused on helping women who had served in combat roles adapt to civilian life while maintaining the confidence and competence that had made them successful in military service. The program served over 2,000 women veterans annually, many of whom had faced challenges similar to those Maria had experienced. Maria showed us that strength and competence in women can be misunderstood or even threatening to people who don't expect those qualities. Crystal said during a conference, on women veterans issues. Our program helps women maintain their military, bearing, and professional standards, while navigating civilian environments that may not immediately recognize their capabilities. The impact of Maria's story extended far beyond individual programs and organizations to influence national policy on veterans affairs. The Maria Santos Act, passed by Congress 3 years after the bombing incident, provided federal funding for community integration programs and required federal contractors to implement veterans' preference policies that recognized military training and experience. The legislation had helped thousands of veterans find meaningful employment and had educated millions of Americans about the ongoing service that veterans provided to their communities. Detective Morrison had been promoted to police chief and had implemented comprehensive training programs that helped law enforcement officers recognize military training and distinguish between competence and conspiracy. The training had been adopted by police departments across the country, with Maria's story serving as a case study in how bias could compromise public safety and how military veterans could be valuable allies in protecting communities. The Maria Santos case taught us that our assumptions about who looks dangerous and who looks trustworthy can be completely wrong. Morrison explained during a law enforcement conference. We were so focused on profiling based on stereotypes that we missed the real threat and persecuted the person who was actually protecting us. Our officers need to understand that military veterans are not potential threats to be monitored, but potential assets to be respected and utilized. Officer Bradley had become a specialist in veterans issues within the police department, working to build bridges between law enforcement and the veteran community. His personal experience with how prejudice had corrupted his professional judgment had made him uniquely qualified to help other officers avoid similar mistakes. He had developed training programs that were now used by police departments in over 30 states. The educational impact of Maria's story extended to schools and universities, where her case was studied in courses on ethics, leadership, and social justice. The Maria Santos case study had become a standard component of curricula in business schools, public administration programs, and criminal justice courses used to illustrate how prejudice could distort judgment and how character could prevail over circumstance. Maria Santos represents the kind of leader that our society needs, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had developed the case study curriculum. She maintained her standards and her dignity under pressure. She performed her duties with excellence, regardless of recognition, and she chose service over self-interest when it mattered most. These are the qualities that we want to develop in our students, regardless of their career paths. The international impact of Maria's story had been equally significant. Her case had been studied by military organizations, law enforcement agencies, and social service programs around the world as an example of how military training could be successfully integrated into civilian life. The Maria Santos model had been adapted for use in countries dealing with the reintegration of former military personnel, with particular emphasis on recognizing and utilizing the skills that veterans brought to civilian communities. Maria herself had become a reluctant but effective public speaker, traveling around the country to address conferences, graduation ceremonies, and community events. Her message was always the same: excellence is its own reward, service is its own honor, and character is revealed not in moments of glory, but in the quiet choices made when no one is watching. The day I disarmed that bomb was not the most important day of my service, Maria told the audience. The most important days were the ones when I chose to maintain my standards and my dignity, while facing persecution from people who didn't understand who I was or what I represented. Those choices made in private moments when no one was watching were what prepared me for the moment when everyone was watching. The Desert Rose Diner continued to operate as a restaurant, but it had become much more than a place to eat. It was a symbol of redemption and transformation, a reminder that communities could change when confronted with the consequences of their prejudices. The staff now included several veterans, and the restaurant had become a gathering place for former military personnel and their families. The booth where Jerry Patterson had once sat complaining about Maria's service had been preserved as part of the museum, with a plaque that read, "In memory of prejudice overcome and understanding achieved." May we never forget that heroes walk among us, often unrecognized until the moment when we need them most. The legacy of Maria Santos extended far beyond the specific events of that April morning in Bakersfield. Her story had become a permanent part of American culture, a reminder that the values we claim to cherish must be protected and nurtured in our daily interactions with the people who embody them. The woman who had been dismissed as just a waitress had become a symbol of service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism that exists in communities across the country. As Maria continued her work with the foundation, speaking to new groups of veterans and community leaders, she remained focused on the future rather than the past. Her message was simple but profound. Excellence is available to everyone. Service is a choice that can be made in any circumstances. And character is revealed through the accumulation of small choices made over time. The bombing that had nearly destroyed a community had instead revealed its capacity for growth, change, and redemption. The woman who had been persecuted as a suspected terrorist had become a symbol of the values that make communities strong. And the quiet dignity that had sustained Maria through months of persecution had become a model for how to maintain integrity in the face of injustice, and how to choose service over self-interest when it matters most. 10 years later, Maria Santos returned to the Desert Rose Diner one final time before her retirement. The woman who had once been just a waitress was now Admiral Maria Santos, the first Hispanic woman to achieve that rank in the U.S. Navy. She had been called back to active duty after the bombing incident, her expertise too valuable to remain in civilian life. As she sat in the same booth where Jerry Patterson had once complained about her service, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her full circle. The diner was bustling with activity, veterans working alongside civilians, former enemies now serving as friends, a community transformed by the recognition that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Frank approached her table, his hair now silver but his smile genuine. "The usual, Admiral?" he asked, using the title with obvious pride. "Just coffee, Frank," Maria replied, "and make it strong. I've got a speech to give at the Academy tomorrow about seeing potential in unexpected places." A young waitress, herself a veteran, brought the coffee with steady hands that reminded Maria of her own journey. The name tag read Lieutenant Sarah Chun, U.S. Army, EOD Specialist. The torch was being passed to a new generation of quiet heroes. As Maria stood to leave, she noticed something that made her smile. Above the counter, next to the memorial plaque, hung a simple sign: "Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves respect. Everyone is capable of greatness." The Desert Rose Diner had become more than a restaurant. It had become a testament to the power of second chances, the importance of looking beyond first impressions, and the truth that heroism often wears ordinary clothes. What did you think of Maria's incredible journey from persecution to recognition? Have you ever misjudged someone based on appearances? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more inspiring true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Until next time, remember, heroes walk among us every day.